Who are the untouchables on the Capitals? Next on Locked On Caps.
Your Locked On Capitals, your daily podcast on the Washington Capitals. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Well, hello and welcome into this edition of Locked On Capitals. I'm so glad you decided to join me today. As always, this podcast is free and available on all the major platforms. And I want to thank you for making this your first listen or view of the day. Yes, this podcast is also available in video form, so head on over to YouTube and check it out. My name is Dan Holney. You can find me on Twitter. It's at DanCaps218. You can find the show on Twitter. It's at Locked On Caps. Today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel Sportsbook, official sportsbook of Locked On. Make every moment more. Visit fanduel.com/locked on today to get started. So in this edition of Locked On Capitals, we talk about who are the untouchables on this team. Oftentimes when I ask people, I'm like, who's the untouchables? And, ultimately, if you had to trade someone, who would you trade? And they'll say something like Sonny Milano or Alexi Protas, just these real nothing burger deals. We'll talk about that in the show. Then later on, we will talk about the future of Peter Laviolette in Washington. And then we will talk about kind of the post-mortem of this season as the Caps have officially been eliminated. But in this episode, we are happy to have Hockey Troll of the Caps Chirp podcast. Hockey Troll, welcome back to the show.
Thanks, man. Yeah, glad to be back. I think this is this the hat trick episode? Is this the third one that I've done with you? Or it's been we've collabed quite a bit this season, which is cool.
Yeah, I want to say about 3 or 4. But one of the things that we were talking about in kind of just the pre-interview here is you were talking about that the Capitals now are officially eliminated from playoff contention. I mean, they've been over for quite some time, but now it's official. Put a fork in them. They're done. Talk to me a little bit about the season. What do you think went wrong?
Yeah, I guess the proverbial fat lady hath finally sung, and it is done. I think that the Washington Capitals have been just absolutely dealt every bad break that you could get on the injury list for sure. Anybody who's followed the team can understand that. We still, I'm sure, lead or games lost by a pretty large margin, I would think. I think injuries were tough. And on top of that, we've got an aging core. And then I think that really what signaled it, and we talked about it around trade deadline, is that management gave up on this team at trade deadline, right? Not so much in a spiteful way, but it was like, look, we're not going to invest anything in the team for this season. We're going to try to reload on the fly in the offseason and just give it the good college try for the rest of this season and really reload and load up for next season, which saw Brian McClellan load up on a lot of assets, right? Draft picks especially. So I guess to answer the original question, like where did it all go wrong? I think injuries were tough. I think that, guys that did return off of major injuries maybe weren't at the same pace, looking especially at Nicholas Backstrom, unfortunately. Not to say that I'm ready to ship him out and, damn him from all of what is the Washington Capitals. I definitely think he needs like another half season and a full off season to recover. But, he was not Backstrom of 4 or 5 years ago, which, you got to give. He's an aging player. We signed him to a nostalgic contract, which honestly at the time was still team friendly. So there's that. I think there's the thing that I hate is that every time things go bad, it's just like, oh, well, the effort's not there. The try is not there. They just don't care enough. I had my last episode, I kind of went on a bit of a rant. It's like, you're talking about professionals here who have to play an incredibly grueling season. On top of that, it's impossible for them to put it 100% in every time. Like they may intend to do that, but physical, whatever mental ailments aside, just living life, it's damn near impossible. And the best players in the league find that consistency and find not getting too high, not getting too low. You hear about it all the time. So I hate to hear people think like, oh, the boys are just giving up on the season. They've put together, every single player in the NHL has put together an incredibly lucrative career over their entire lifetime, predicated entirely on winning. So this is not an effort thing. It's not, they weren't trying. Maybe they were trying to get the coach fired. Who knows? That's the closest I've ever heard of any player saying, admitting that like, hey, it was over. But yeah, that's my rant on that.
And it was one of the things that, even in the beginning of the season, a lot of the beat writers around the Capitals said that, they're probably not going to make it to the playoffs. And I foolishly thought to myself, I think they're wrong. They went out and picked Connor Brown, Dylan Strome, Darcy Kemper, Charlie Lindgren. Kind of seemed like the team was loaded for bear, but then Connor Brown got injured within his first couple games there. And that's when the wheel really started to wobble, I guess. Then you could also say Nick Backstrom having that hip resurfacing procedure. Now, even though he wasn't supposed to be back until the end of the year, he came back in January. I still don't believe that he is at 100%. And then, of course, Tom Wilson. And I think that if you had Tom Wilson and Nick Backstrom in the lineup, I think they would at least be a couple points higher in the standings. I don't think they would have won the Metro or anything crazy like that. But I think that's what it kind of boils down to me, is that kind of thing is just, kind of being up against it all season. Then you take a look at it and you have TJ Oshie, who always plays much bigger than he is in the lineup, out of the lineup. Darcy Kemper, who missed a good chunk of the month of December. Charlie Lindgren had to get put in there. So it's kind of difficult for me to assess this team and who they really are. At the end of the season, when they play the final game of the season, and someone says, what was the identity of this team? I would say, I'm not entirely sure, because they never played, pretty much the whole season as a whole unit. It was, fragmented. I believe what it was is they were the third most injured on hockeymen or guys that were injured in all the NHL. So it's vacillated between number 1 and number 3, but they've been up against it all season. If you were to say, what is the identity of this past season's team, what would you say it is?
A revolving door through the hospital, man. Like they're an ambulance. It was a Band-Aid all season. To your point, I still think that like the DC hockey vibe is still there, right? I mean, we still get pucks deep, we still bang bodies, we're still a big team. We try to play with some creativity and crash the net. And what I've liked of recent in the good points of our game is that our goals, I feel like the Washington Capitals do a lot of perimeter shooting and they try to get rebounds. But the thing is that lately I've seen a lot of net crashing, 4 red jerseys in front of the net, banging away. And if you're going to, it goes back to the effort thing. That is the hardest place to score, is in front of the net, getting hacked, getting beat up. Why would you do that if you didn't have pride in what you were doing at this stage in the game? So I definitely think that, to your point, the identity was in concept there, but in execution, we couldn't get it done. And, you mentioned all those injuries. And I think one of the most important injuries that was really detrimental for the Washington Capitals was John Carlson. He gets a lot of hate because he's apt to, try to stretch the play out and maybe he coughs a muffin up. But when you have a guy playing 25 plus minutes a night and just eating those minutes, those big minutes for a team, you're going to get that. I mean, it's the same thing in Pittsburgh with Chris Letang. It's the same thing for any defenseman who's eating that type of minute, has that type of workload. There's going to be places where they mess up, right? Luckily with John Carlson for the Caps, he's much better net positive as far as putting puck in the back of the net, racking up points, and still being, a very viable shutdown guy and really just an anchor back there. So when he went down, I mean, we didn't have the, Backstrom, Nicky, and Wilson, but the final straw, I think, that broke the camel's back was losing him for that many games with that head injury. And, Al Koken said, like, 4 or 5 games ago, like, this is like the 4th game that Backstrom, Wilson, and Carlson have played together. That's wild. And that's like within the last 20 games of the season.
Yeah, it's kind of crazy to think about, what could have been. That's what I'll always be wondering about. All right, so after the break here, I'm going to tell you who I think the untouchables are on this Capitals team. There's only a few of them. Let's talk about it after the break. When you're drafting your fantasy team, do whatever you need to and handpick your stars for your next business team. If you're building your talent roster, you need Indeed. Indeed is the hiring platform where you can attract, interview, and hire all in one place. Don't spend hours on multiple job sites looking for candidates with the right skills when you can do it all with Indeed. Find top talent fast with Indeed's suite of powerful hiring tools like matching, assessments, and virtual interviews. Hate waiting? Indeed's U.S. data shows over 80% of Indeed employees find quality candidates whose resume on Indeed matches their job description the moment they hire and when they need the job. Indeed knows what you need, and when you're hiring for your business, you have to make every dollar count. That's why you need Indeed. You only pay for quality applicants that match your must-have requirements. Visit Indeed.com/locked on to start hiring now. Just go to Indeed.com/locked on. Indeed.com/locked on. Terms and conditions apply. Cost per application pricing not available for everyone. Need to hire? You need Indeed. All right, welcome back into this edition of Locked On Capitals, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. So the biggest thing for me is everyone's talking about, this season sucked, but next year it's going to be better. And I always to say to those people, how is it going to be better? If you take a look at the free agents out there, there's Connor Sherry, there's Carl Hagelin, there is Matt Irwin. There's these players of little impact. So ostensibly, the players that played this year are going to be the exact same players that are going to be playing next year. So the definition of insanity is doing the same thing again and again and expecting a different result. You've got to be insane to think that this team is going to be better next year unless they really shake things up. Who are my untouchables on this team, period? It is Alex Ovechkin, Tom Wilson, John Carlson. That's it. Let's face it, Nick Backstrom is important to this team, but he's on the back nine of his hockey career. And a lot of times I hear people talk about, they're like, Nick Backstrom, oh my God, are you crazy? Let's face it, what was going on out on the ice this year wasn't cutting it. Case in point, I brought this up to someone on Twitter. I said, who are your untouchables? He says, other than Ovechkin, I would say Backstrom and Oshie. I'd also like to keep Carlson, Milano, Strome, Wilson, Faravari, TVR, Dowd, Protas, and Alexiev. So pretty much the same lineup next year is your untouchables. Now, where I was going to add a fourth player was the netminder Darcy Kemper. But the one thing that the Capitals have in spades is netminders, and really great netminders down in Hershey. Now, I'm not in love with the idea of moving on from Darcy, but I don't think they should give these players away. I think that they should get a return. I don't think they should give away Nick Backstrom, but I would be at least opening to listening to offers. How, in your assessment, is this team going to get better unless you make major changes? Let's face it, the Blues probably didn't want to lose Tarasenko. The Blackhawks probably didn't want to lose Patrick Kane. The Sharks didn't want to lose Timo Meier. The Arizona Coyotes didn't want to lose Chychrun. Sometimes you need to peel that Band-Aid off and make changes. I know that Caps fans are trying to keep the band together and hoping that the 2018 Washington Capitals can bang out another really great track. I just don't know if it's the case. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, and I mean, honestly, it's a good assessment. I'll somewhat agree on that. The problem is that when you talk about trades, the other team wants to get better too, man. Right. And unfortunately, we have a lot of sunken capital, right, on the roster. You've got Anthony Mantha, right, who, man, I mean, flashes of brilliance, and that's about it, right? The guy can't finish. He's, the same thing that happened in Detroit, right? I mean, this is his second stint in a team that's given him a chance, right? Detroit, he's a massive guy. He seems unwilling to play the physical game, which is okay. You don't need to be that physical guy, if you're just because you're big. You can create space through being big and doing that. But Anthony Mantha seems to be unable to while maybe his possession metrics are okay, he's still not able to really bury. And that's what happened. That's what we need at the end. You talked about Backstrom too. Unfortunately, I don't feel like a team. First of all, he's probably got. I'm sure he's got a no movement clause, right? So he'd have to waive that for a trade. He wants to stay in DC. He's a fan favorite. I feel like the only way that we're going to shed cap space on Backstrom, unfortunately, is a buyout, and that is not a win-win. That's something that you do when you're making a push, which is what we're going to be doing. But we're not going to return anything for him besides cap space if we do a buyout. I agree. I think Ovi's untouchable. I would put Wilson, on that untouchable list, though. I think Brian McClellan, as savvy as he is fielding all calls. You look at these young guys, those replacement level players that you talked about, like Sheary, Protas. I really liked Protas this season. You've got like even guys like Nick Dowd, and previously Garnet Hathaway. These are guys who, while we love them and I think they're awesome players and people, they are a skill set that is common in the NHL. I think that the Washington Capitals, and again, I'm a little bit of a homer, but I think that they need a top 6 forward and they really need to replenish their blue line. So I think that basically everybody who's a UFA right now is gone. I think that they're all just going to be let to go to pasture and test the free market. And that includes Connor Sheary, who was, in December, in the early part of the season, the saving grace of the Washington Capitals. He was incredible. Then went silent. And as of late, he's banged in a couple of goals, which is great. But again, kind of that's Connor Sheary, his whole career. That's why he's been a journeyman. Those type of guys are going to go. Hagelin, same thing. We've just been waiting for that contract to end. The positive of it all is that UFA juice is going to be able to give us a lot of flexibility in who we can sign. And on top of that, if they made, I think it was like 100 million or something in profit, in the last GM meeting, Bettman said that if the league made 100 million, that the cap could raise up to 4 million next season. Now, projections currently look like maybe 1 to 2, and then next season it's going to go up again. But yeah, there's decisions to be made. I think a big hot button person is Kuznetsov right now. There was that rumor that he wanted to trade, which he squashed. But at the same time, he's had a season and a half, 2 seasons of, subpar performance, if you will, compared to his contract. And that's another tough one to move, right? So you're going to have to sell a player like that. And honestly, you're going to have to sell almost all of our big name players to, another team based upon potential and past performance, not what they're doing now. The other guys who we've locked in, like Strome, Milano, those are all really good contracts. They are movable, but do we really want that to happen? I'm not sure. They're 2 young guys that could be the future of the team. I think that they stay. I think a lot of just based upon, all of that kind of middle tier, like the Milanos, the Stromes, the, not the big names like Kuznetsov, but, Protas, Ferviari, obviously Carlson. I think that those type of guys are just going to stay put based upon, the return isn't big enough for McClellan and just kind of how the landscape is naturally going to settle. I guess I wouldn't be surprised if we did move a big piece, though, 1 or maybe even 2 big pieces in Kuznetsov, maybe even a blue liner like Ferviari, maybe even a goaltender, right? But again, all of these contracts that I think that Brian McClellan has signed in this offseason have been pretty friendly, right? They're not repulsive albatrosses that have a really big downside. They're pretty much middle of the row. They could go either way. And it's not a huge investment for any team that wants to trade for those guys that we just got, right? And then keep in mind, you got Connor Brown there. What's going to happen with him? He was a 1-year rental. Are we going to give him another shot after being injured on the shelf for a full season? Who knows? In my opinion, you might as well just let him walk. He was huge. A lot of people who really follow hockey were like, oh man, that's a really like savvy pickup by McClellan. We got to see like nothing of him. So I think that just through the natural UFA progression, we're going to see guys walk off into the sunset. And then I think that through the deals that McClellan will eventually make, guys are just going to remain untouched because the return's not there.
Yeah, I mean, and the tough thing for me on the blue line is that I thought there was going to be a lot of change, but then he kind of solidified all those. He gave Rasmus Sandin a new deal, TVR got a new deal, Jensen got a new deal, Faravari's an RFA, Alexiev's an RFA. So the blue line, unless he makes changes, is going to be the blue line next year. And, you know, I'm going to say that they struggled this last season, I guess, as suffices to say here. Taking a look at the free agents and who's out there, like I talked about, there's not a lot of them, you know, that are going to make a difference. Connor Brown, Craig Smith, Carl Hagelin, Connor Sherry, and then you look at Alexiev, who is an RFA, Faravari, who is an RFA, and Matt Irwin. That's it. I mean, and then, you know, the thing of it is that's not a real game changer for me. And kind of the reason that I picked out some of the players that I listed is you take a look at Nick Backstrom, for example. His final contract is 24-25. Are the Capitals going to give Backstrom another new deal after 24-25? This team that's already old. You take a look at Tom Wilson, who I love Tom Wilson, but a scary thing for me, next year is his last year. The 23-24 contract is it, and then Tom Wilson hits the market as a UFA. Take a look at TJ Oshie, same thing, the year after, 24-25. So the thing of it is, and kind of how I came to this conclusion is that there's 2 years left. Should they try to get something for these guys now, where they could, you know, maybe make the most on their return? I know that, you know, people are like, are you effing crazy? Nick Backstrom, he's one of the you know, beloved, and I love Nick Backstrom, don't get me wrong, but there's not a lot of, you know, time left on his contract. And one of the things I hear as well is, when is it going to be Connor McMichael's turn? Into that, I say, sure, who comes out? Does Backstrom come out? Kuznetsov, Dowd? Who's coming out of the lineup so he can go in? I guess the knee-jerk thing would be to say Kuznetsov, but we always want to hear that these guys in Hershey are looking for their opportunity. And my question is where do they fit in? I mean, pretty much all the lines, all the positions are spoken for. It's kind of a logjam for this team. And my big fear is I think I'm going to be having the same conversation with you next April. Not that I don't want to talk to you, but I hope it's not about the same thing. Do you see this team getting better between this year and next year? And if so, how?
Yeah, that's a great question. Because I was also looking especially at the center UFA waiver wire and seeing, like, you know, what's out there. And there's not a lot. There's no UFAs that I think have the pedigree or the skill set that's going to really push us over the top. What I do see, though, is I see a lot of cap space, like those handful of players that you just mentioned that are becoming UFAs. That's just money in the bank for us to spend, right? And we will spend it. McClellan will spend it. And in the most positive version of this, we need like one perfect fit top 6 guy, right? And then our offense gets some juice. Kuznetsov comes back better than ever. Oshie is healthy. Backstrom shows some improvement. And if that is the case, then this team looks competitive, right? Unfortunately, everything that we've seen up to this point has not been that. There's 100 different variables as to why that is, none of which we know for sure. But just from an observer standpoint, you know, you've got to think that Wilson's going to have a great offseason, get back to, you know, 100%. Backstrom hopefully shows some material improvement. Kuznetsov figures it out, right? Because we have seen where Kuznetsov would have a down year, come back and just be outstanding. And you look at a guy right now, I feel like the Washington Capitals, like, biggest hurdle is on the offensive side is Kuznetsov. Like, if he plays to a 70, 80 point, 100 point potential that he has, that we've seen, this is a completely different team, right? We're having a completely different conversation. Right now, everybody's reeling. There's a frustrated group. Performance has not been great, or at least execution hasn't been great. it's really tough to say what the team's going to look like now. I love your DC pessimism, though. I know, I love it. I definitely.
I'm a
That is,
Nationals fan too. It just it keeps flowing here. So
yeah, it is. It is very on brand for the DC market, and it's warranted, right? I mean, I was just tweeting like, the Washington Capitals do hold the record for the worst NHL season in history. So that's something that we'll always have, Caps fans, for sure. But to your point, in the off season, we're in unfamiliar territory as far as covering the Caps. This is probably the most exciting offseason that's going to happen in the OV era period. Every time we're just bolting on guys, and it seems to be like a good move, right? Or maybe it's a bad move and it doesn't really matter because we have so much star power. But next season, who knows? And we talk about those contracts that were just signed. Last couple years, because of COVID, the market's been down for like what type of contracts people are signing, which was an opportunity for ownership and GMs to lock in some real cap stability there, right? And that's been done. And now that we're kind of exiting that, and that now we're seeing the cap kind of go up, those contracts that we've signed even up to this year at a decent deal are still movable, right? So we still have free agency to open. We can make moves during the season. I feel like McClellan will make a lot of moves in the offseason, but I would not call him done until the final day of free agency.
some interesting moves lie ahead for sure. This is the first time the Capitals have missed the playoffs since 2014. That was the Adam Oates era, and subsequently the last year that Adam Oates was the head coach of this team. That leads us into our next segment after the break. Is Peter Laviolette done in DC? We'll talk about that after the break. The NBA playoffs are almost here, and now is the perfect time to download the FanDuel Sports app, America's #1 sports book, because new customers get a no-sweat first bet up to $1,000. That's bonus bets back if your first bet doesn't win. Just download the FanDuel Sportsbook app. It's safe, secure, and super easy to use. Then you can bet on everything from the money line to point scores and threes drained. Plus, FanDuel even lets you combine your bets for a chance at a bigger game payout with a same-game parlay. So don't miss the chance to get your no-sweat first bet up to $1,000 in bonus bets back when you go to FanDuel.com/lockedon. That's FanDuel.com/lockedon to learn more. Make every moment more with FanDuel, an official sports betting partner of the NBA. All right, welcome back into this edition of Locked On Capitals, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. So how I closed out the last segment was talking about Adam Oates. That was the last year he was head coach when the Caps missed the playoffs for the first time in quite some time, was in 2014. Now we are in 2023, and the Capitals missed the playoffs yet again. What do they do with Peter Laviolette? Now, I'm a fan of Peter Laviolette, but I know how this movie goes. I've seen it before. The knee-jerk reaction is to get the head coach and get him out of here. I will say that Brian McClellan was very non-committal in the preseason, as he should be, I guess. So there are some intriguing names out there, most notably Spencer Carberry and Jeff Halpern. So what are your thoughts on it? Do you ultimately believe this spells the end of Peter Laviolette in DC, and who are some of your front runners as the new head coach?
Yeah, I think that Lavi's cooked, unfortunately. And honestly, this is one of those times where I don't believe it was his fault at all. I really think that he was dealt the worst hand. He came in, COVID happened, then it didn't. And then injuries for the past two seasons, right? So you look, he's been on the squad for 3 years. He had a COVID season and 2 injury-riddled seasons as well. You look at Laviolette's track record. He is the most winning coach, American-born winning coach in the NHL. He is, you want to talk pedigree, he's got it. And not only that, the attractive part for me for Laviolette I was hard on I was like, we don't want Gallant, we want Laviolette because he is the guy that can get you there quick, right? He comes in within the first couple seasons in the past 3 teams that he's been on, he's won gotten to a team to the finals within 3 years. That's what we wanted, right? He's just been dealt such a trash hand, and it's sad to see because I don't, I'm not. I think that he this may I don't think his coaching career is over by any means, like it was with Reardon, like it was when a head coaching career with Adam Oates, with Dale Hunter, with those guys, because I think that a lot of the GMs around the league are looking at Laviolette and saying, like, man, he just could not catch a break at all. But at that same time, we talk about a coach being fired, but
Why don't you tell everyone where we can find your work?
absolutely, man. Thanks a lot for having me again. It's always a good time. You can find us or you can find the official Caps Chirp podcast on all social media at Caps Chirp, and you can follow me on all social media at Hockey Trollin with an IN.
All right. Thank you for joining us. Thank you for making Locked On Capitals your first listen today. Now make your second listen Locked On Game to Game NHL. Every moment, every top performance, every result. Locked On Game to Game covers every game across the NHL with local analysis that only Locked On can deliver. Follow Locked On Game to Game NHL, available on the Odyssey app, YouTube, and wherever you get your podcasts. So once again, thank you for joining me on this edition of Locked On Capitals, where it's your team every day. My name is Dan Holme, and I'll talk to you again next time.